I'm a simple man. I don't ask for much. A quiet life, a good book, and the gentle lapping of water against the hull of my boat on a Saturday morning. For 10 years, that's exactly what I had in the manicured, deceptively placid community of Willow Creek. My pride and joy, a restored 22-foot sailboat I named the Serenity, was my escape. It was my therapy, my connection to a simpler time. But all that changed the day Carol Albright was elected HOA president. Carol was a woman who seemed to be powered by low-grade misery and an insatiable lust for trivial authority. She walked around with a clipboard and a perpetual smirk, treating our neighborhood not as a community of homes, but as her personal fiefdom. Her reign began with small things, passive-aggressive notes about lawn length, new regulations on the acceptable shade of beige for mailboxes. We grumbled, but we complied. Then she came for my boat. The letter arrived in a crisp, offensively cheerful-looking envelope. It cited a newly minted bylaw, passed in a special session none of us were told about, prohibiting any watercraft over 15 feet from using the community lake. The reason? Preserving the aesthetic tranquility and uniform appearance of our shared natural resources. It was nonsense, of course. My boat was the only one on the lake over 15 feet. This wasn't a rule. It was a targeted attack. What Carol didn't know, what no one in Willow Creek knew, was that before I retired to this quiet life, I was a civil engineer. My specialty wasn't buildings or bridges, but something far more fundamental: water resource management, dams, and the complex web of property rights that go with them. She thought she was poking a retired accountant. She was about to find out she'd kicked a hornet's nest, and I was more than ready to show her what a real sting felt like. Have you ever been pushed so far that the only reasonable response feels like pure, unadulterated madness? This is that story, and I promise you, the fallout was biblical. I decided to start by playing her game. I believed, foolishly, that reason and decency might prevail. I prepared for the next monthly HOA meeting like a lawyer preparing for trial. I gathered photos of the Serenity on the lake, looking majestic and anything but disruptive. I had testimonials from neighbors, before Carol had poisoned the well, anyway, saying how much they enjoyed seeing the sail on the water. I even had documentation from the original community prospectus, which explicitly mentioned sailing and recreational boating as a key amenity. I walked into that meeting feeling prepared, armed with logic and a sense of righteous indignation. The community center was Carol's throne room. She sat at the head of a long table, flanked by her two sycophantic board members, a mousy woman named Brenda and a belligerent man named Gary who seemed to get a thrill from her every proclamation. I waited patiently through the tedious agenda items until she called for new business. I stood up, cleared my throat, and began my presentation. I was calm, respectful, and laid out my case piece by piece. I spoke of tradition, of the original community promise, of my impeccable record of safety and maintenance. For a moment, I saw a flicker of understanding in the eyes of some of the residents, but not in Carol's. She let me finish, a condescending smile plastered on her face. "Thank you for your passionate plea, Mr. Henderson," she began, her voice dripping with faux sympathy. "However, the board's decision is final. The new bylaw is about progress. It's about elevating our community standards. A large, frankly cumbersome vessel like yours detract from the pristine, natural view we're trying to cultivate." I tried to rebut, pointing to the prospectus. She waved a dismissive hand. "That was then, this is now. We are under new leadership with a new vision." Gary chimed in, "Yeah, rules are rules. If you don't like it, maybe this isn't the community for you." The finality of it was a slap in the face. But Carol wasn't done. The very next day, a new notice was pinned to my door. A fine, $50 a day for as long as my boat remained on my own property, now in violation of a new unauthorized vehicle storage clause she'd apparently invented overnight. She wasn't just banning me from the lake. She was trying to force me to get rid of my boat entirely. That night, sitting in my study, staring at the fine, the frustration curdled into something colder, harder. The path of reason was a dead end. She had declared war, and she had all the power within the closed system of the HOA. But what if the system wasn't as closed as she thought? I pulled out my old textbooks, my professional journals, and I started digging. My investigation began not with the HOA, but with the lake itself. A quiet rage fueled my late-night research sessions. Carol's power stemmed from her control over the community's prized jewel. If I could find a crack in her authority over the lake, I could bring her whole, flimsy empire down. I started with county property records, cross-referencing parcel maps with historical surveys. The HOA owned the land surrounding the lake, the parks, the boat ramp. That much was clear. But the lake itself? It was an artificial reservoir, created decades before Willow Creek was ever developed. It existed because of a single, crucial piece of infrastructure, a small, earthen dam at the northernmost edge of the property, where Willow Creek itself flowed out. I focused my entire attention on that dam. Who built it? Who owned it? On the county assessor's website, I found it. Parcel 47B-3. It wasn't listed as owned by the Willow Creek Homeowners Association. It was a tiny, oddly shaped piece of land, listed under the ownership of a corporation I'd never heard of, AgriStructures Incorporated. My heart began to beat a little faster. A few more hours of digging through state corporate filings revealed that AgriStructures Incorporated had been dissolved in 1988. The original owner, a farmer named Jedediah Miller, had built the dam to create an irrigation pond for his crops. When the farmland was sold to developers to build our subdivision, that one tiny, crucial parcel with the dam on, it had somehow been left out of the master sale agreement. It was a clerical error, a forgotten remnant of a bygone era. Legally, it was an orphan property. Its ownership had passed to Jedediah's sole heir, a son who had moved to Oregon 30 years ago and likely had no idea he even owned a dam in the middle of a suburban development. This was it. This was the aha moment. Carol's authority, the HOA's claim to the lake, was built on sand. They managed the shoreline, but they didn't own the plug. I spent the next 2 days tracking down Jedediah's son, a man named Robert Miller. I found him living in a small town outside of Portland. When I finally got him on the phone, he was confused. A dam? In North Carolina? I think my dad built something like that, but I figured it was sold off with the rest of the farm. I explained the situation, carefully avoiding my specific motivations. I told him the property was creating a potential liability for him, an attractive nuisance in legal terms, and that I was an engineer interested in acquiring and properly managing such unique pieces of infrastructure. He was more than happy to be rid of it. We settled on a price that was, frankly, laughably small, less than the cost of a used car. He was just thrilled to unload a forgotten property and the yearly pittance of a tax bill that went with it. My plan began to form, and it was audacious, terrifying, and beautiful in its simplicity. I wouldn't just challenge Carol's authority. I would dismantle it. I would take away her precious lake. The plan required absolute precision and secrecy. The first step was to create a layer of anonymity. I contacted my lawyer and had him set up a simple limited liability company, or LLC. We called it Watershed Management Solutions. It sounded official, boring, and utterly untraceable back to Mark Henderson, the quiet guy in House 24. All the purchase documents for the dam and parcel 47B-3 were filed under this LLC. To Robert Miller in Oregon, I was just a representative of a small engineering firm. To the county clerk's office, it was just another routine property transfer. While the paperwork was being processed, I threw myself into the second phase, a thorough engineering and legal review. I wasn't some reckless vigilante. I was a professional. I drove out to the dam, which was accessible via a small, unpaved service road that no one in the neighborhood ever used. It was smaller than the big hydroelectric dams I'd worked on, but the principles were the same. An earthen embankment, a concrete spillway, and a manually operated sluice gate controlled by a large cast-iron wheel. It was old but solid. I spent a weekend taking measurements, checking for structural wear, and consulting old state hydrology charts. I needed to know exactly what would happen when I opened that gate. Where would the water go? It would flow back into the original channel of Willow Creek, which wound its way through a state-owned nature preserve downstream. There would be a temporary surge, but the creek bed was more than capable of handling the volume. There were no homes, no farms, no infrastructure downstream that would be affected. Legally, I was on solid ground. As the new owner of the dam, I had the water rights. I had the right to perform maintenance, to inspect the foundations, and to lower the water level as necessary to do so. The law was clear. While all this was happening in the shadows, Carol's reign of terror continued in the open. She was drunk on her victory over me. The HOA newsletter featured a glossy photo of the lake, taken from an angle that carefully excluded my house. With a triumphant headline, "A New Era of Community Excellence," she organized a Lakeside Founders Gala, a black-tie event to celebrate her new vision. She was building her entire identity, her entire platform, on her control of that lake. She had no idea that control was an illusion, and the deed to her kingdom was sitting in a file on my desk. My boat, the Serenity, sat forlornly in my driveway under a tarp, a constant, silent reminder of her arrogance and my daily motivation. Every morning, I'd get a new $50 fine slipped under my door, and every morning I'd pin it to a corkboard in my office. The board was getting full. The day the finalized stamped deed arrived by courier was a day of quiet, profound satisfaction. I held the paper in my hand. It was just a document, ink on a page, but it was the key. It was the lever that would move the world. My world, at least. And it would bring Carol's crashing down. The final phase of my strategy felt like a military operation. I wasn't just going to drain the lake. I was going to do it in a way that was legally unimpeachable and maximally effective. First, I drafted an official-looking letter on Watershed Management Solutions letterhead. It was addressed to the Willow Creek HOA Board of Directors. It stated, in dry, technical language, that as the new owners of Parcel 47B-3, we will be conducting a necessary and time-sensitive structural integrity inspection and sediment flush of the Willow Creek Dam. It informed them that this would require a controlled, phased drawdown of the reservoir over the following 48 hours, beginning on Friday morning. I mailed the letter via certified mail, timed to arrive on Thursday afternoon, giving them notice, but not enough time to mount any meaningful legal challenge, even if they could figure out who to sue. Next, I hired a two-man crew from town over. I didn't need them for the physical labor. I could turn the sluice gate wheel myself, but I needed them as witnesses. They were a licensed and insured small-scale excavation company, and I paid them a handsome fee to simply be on site, in their company truck, to observe and document the procedure as per our internal safety protocols. Their presence would lend an air of legitimacy and professionalism to the whole affair. While I finalized my preparations, Carol was in her glory. It was the week of her ridiculous Lakeside Founders Gala, scheduled for Saturday evening. Invitations had gone out. A marquee was being erected in the park by the boat ramp. She was strutting around the neighborhood with an unparalleled level of smugness, overseeing the preparations like a queen planning her coronation. The irony was so thick I could taste it. She was planning the grand celebration of her lake, just as I was planning its temporary demise. Her power was at its absolute peak, a bubble of ego and arrogance inflated to its maximum size. And I was holding the pin. On Thursday afternoon, I saw the mail truck make its rounds. I imagined Carol or one of her minions signing for my certified letter. I pictured the confusion, the frantic phone calls. Who is Watershed Management Solutions? They own the dam? How is that possible? Their entire world, their entire understanding of their authority would be upended in a single moment. I felt a grim satisfaction. They had pushed a quiet man into a corner, and in doing so, they had forced him to remember that he wasn't just a quiet man. He was an engineer who understood the world in terms of loads, stresses, and breaking points. And Carol Albright and her HOA had reached their breaking point. Friday morning arrived, cool and clear. It was the perfect day for some dam maintenance. I met my two-man crew at the service road entrance at 7 a.m. sharp. They were sipping coffee in their truck, a big diesel pickup with Johnson Brothers Excavation on the side. I handed them a clipboard with a simple checklist I'd typed up, making it all look official. Your only job today, I told them, is to watch me from the truck, make sure I don't fall in, and if anyone shows up to ask questions, you refer them to me. Your company is just here as a third-party safety observer." They shrugged, happy to be getting paid handsomely for a day of doing next to nothing. I walked out onto the concrete walkway of the dam. The great iron wheel of the sluice gate was rusted but sturdy. It took a long-handled wrench and most of my body weight to break the initial seal. With a groaning shriek of metal on metal, it began to turn. At first, nothing happened. Then I heard it, a low gurgle from deep within the structure. A moment later, a plume of murky water burst from the outlet on the other side, tumbling down the concrete spillway and into the creek bed below. It wasn't a flood, but a steady, powerful stream. The drawdown had begun. I gave the wheel another full turn, increasing the flow, then another. I locked it in place. The process would be slow, not a dramatic dam break like in the movies, but a relentless, steady draining. A death by 1,000 gallons. I spent the morning sitting in a camping chair I'd brought, sipping my own coffee and watching. Around 9 a.m., the first sign of panic emerged. A resident out for a jog stopped and stared at the unusually turbulent water near the dam. He saw me, saw the Johnson Brothers truck, and jogged over, looking concerned. "Hey, what's going on here?" he asked. I stood up and smiled politely. "Just some routine maintenance on the dam, sir. Nothing to worry about." He looked skeptical but shrugged and continued his run. An hour later, 2 more residents appeared, then a small group. The news was spreading. The water level, almost imperceptibly at first, was now noticeably lower. A muddy ring was beginning to appear around the edge of the entire lake. The calls must have been flying. Just before noon, a car sped down the service road, kicking up dust. It screeched to a halt, and out stormed Carol Albright. She was a vision of pure fury, her face red, a copy of my letter crumpled in her fist. Brenda and Gary tumbled out after her. She marched right up to me, jabbing a finger in my chest. "Who in the hell do you think you are?" she shrieked. "You can't do this. This is community property. I'm calling the police." This was the moment I had been waiting for. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't get angry. I simply took a calm sip of my coffee and said, "First, I'd suggest you don't trespass on private property. You're currently standing on land owned by my company. Second, I'm Mark Henderson. And third, you should know that I already called the sheriff's department this morning to inform them of our legally sanctioned maintenance schedule. They have a copy of our permit and our deed. So please, feel free to call them. They're expecting you." Carol froze mid-rant, her mouth hanging open. The mention of the sheriff, the deed, my name, it was a combination of blows that left her staggering. Her 2 cronies looked back and forth between us, their bravado evaporating like mist. "Your company?" she sputtered, the words catching in her throat. "What are you talking about?" "The HOA owns this lake." I allowed myself a small, tight smile. This was the checkmate I had worked so hard for. "You're mistaken," I said, my voice level and clear, cutting through the morning air. "The HOA owns the land around the lake. A very nice park, I'll admit. But the dam that creates the lake and the water rights that go with it have always been a separate, privately held parcel. As of last week, that parcel is owned by me. Or, more precisely, my LLC." I gestured back at the dam, where the water was still pouring out with a steady, deep roar. "And as the owner, I've decided the structure is long overdue for a full inspection of its footings. Can't be too careful, you know." Liability, Gary, trying to regain some semblance of toughness, puffed out his chest. "This is crazy. You can't just drain the lake. What about the property values? What about the gala tomorrow night?" The gala. It was the perfect tell. It was never about community standards or aesthetics. It was about their power, their social standing, their party. "I'm not sure what to tell you about your party, Gary," I said, turning my gaze to him. "Maybe you can rebrand it as a Mudflats Festival. As for property values, perhaps the HOA shouldn't have built its entire marketing platform on an asset it never actually owned or controlled. That sounds like a case of gross mismanagement, maybe even misrepresentation to the homeowners. I'm sure there are lawyers who would find that very interesting." The color drained from their faces. The threat, though veiled, was clear. Their entire position of authority was built on a lie of omission, and I had just exposed it. By now, a crowd of about 20 or 30 residents had gathered, drawn by the commotion and the surreal sight of their beloved lake shrinking before their eyes. They heard everything. They saw Carol's sputtering rage and my calm, factual demolition of her authority. They looked at the widening mudflats at the docks that were now sitting several feet above the water, and they looked at Carol. The awe and respect she had once commanded were curdling into suspicion and anger. She had lost control of the narrative, and with it, control of the residents. Her power was hemorrhaging out of her as fast as the water was hemorrhaging out of the lake. The climax wasn't a shout. It was a quiet, dawning realization that spread through the crowd of homeowners. They weren't looking at me as the villain anymore. They were looking at Carol. One man, a neighbor I knew from a few houses down, stepped forward. "Is this true, Carol? Did the HOA not own the dam?" Carol spun on him, her voice cracking with desperation. "This is a procedural matter. He's a disgruntled resident trying to sabotage our community." But the lie was too thin. The evidence was all around us, in the gushing water, in the deed I now held up for all to see, in my unshakable composure. I didn't need to argue. The truth was doing the work for me. "I'm not disgruntled, Carol," I said, my voice carrying over the crowd. "I'm a property owner exercising my rights. The same rights you tried to deny me. You came after my boat with a made-up rule. You fined me for parking it in my own driveway. You used the HOA as your personal hammer to beat down anyone you didn't like. The only difference between you and me is that my authority is real. It's on this deed. Yours was an illusion, and it's over." She looked around, searching for support, but found only stony faces and accusing eyes. The people she had lorded it over, the people she had fined and nitpicked, were seeing her for what she was, a petty tyrant whose bluff had just been called in the most spectacular way possible. Her kingdom wasn't a kingdom at all. It was a mud pit, and she was the one who had led them there through her own hubris. Defeated, she turned and stormed back to her car, Gary and Brenda scurrying after her like disgraced courtiers. The crowd was silent for a moment, watching them go. Then they turned to me. The mood wasn't celebratory. It was tense, uncertain. They had just watched their biggest asset literally go down the drain. The man who had spoken up before asked the question on everyone's mind. "So what now? Are you just going to leave it like this?" I looked at the vast, muddy expanse that was emerging. The skeletons of old tree stumps, hidden for decades, were now visible. The lake was a scar. "For now, yes," I said honestly. "The inspection needs to be thorough. But my company, Watershed Management Solutions, is always open to a conversation with a reasonable, good-faith community partner." The implication was clear. The HOA, as it was currently constituted, was not that partner. The gala was, of course, canceled. The marquee was taken down in disgrace. Over the next week, Willow Creek was a community in turmoil. An emergency meeting was called, but this time I didn't attend. I didn't have to. The residents, now fully aware of Carol's overreach and deception, did the work for me. She was removed as president in a landslide vote of no confidence. Her cronies, Gary and Brenda, resigned in shame. The old board was dissolved, and an interim committee was formed. A week after that, I received a new letter. This one was not in a cheerful, aggressive envelope. It was a simple business letter, formally requesting a meeting between me, as the representative of Watershed Management Solutions, and the new interim HOA committee. The war was over. The negotiation was about to begin. The aftermath was a study in contrasts. Carol Albright's downfall was swift and total. Humiliated, she and her husband put their house on the market within a month and moved away. Rumor had it they downsized significantly, their grand lifestyle no longer sustainable without the perceived prestige of her HOA presidency. Gary and Brenda became pariahs in the neighborhood, eventually fading into the background, their brief moment of borrowed power gone forever. My boat, the Serenity, remained under its tarp in my driveway, a silent monument to the whole affair. The fines had stopped, of course. The corkboard they were pinned to became a strange trophy of a battle I never wanted to fight, but was proud to have won. The meeting with the new interim committee was held not in the hostile community center, but on my dining room table. They were humbled, apologetic, and ready to listen. They were just regular homeowners who had been swept up in Carol's agenda and were now left to clean up the mess. I laid out my terms. They were simple. First, the rescinding of all the petty, vindictive bylaws passed under Carol's tenure, including the one targeting my boat. Second, the adoption of a new HOA charter that included strict transparency rules and term limits for all board members. Third, a formal, written apology from the HOA to me for the harassment and baseless fines. In exchange, once these conditions were met and legally ratified, Watershed Management Solutions would deem its inspection complete and would begin the process of closing the sluice gate and allowing the lake to refill. It would take time, but their prized amenity would return. They agreed to everything without hesitation. They had learned a valuable lesson about the dangers of unchecked power. The lake bed remained exposed for the better part of 2 months while the legal gears turned. It became a strange local attraction. Kids found old bottles and fishing lures in the mud. The community, stripped of its central vanity, was forced to actually talk to each other. They organized neighborhood cleanups, not because an HOA told them to, but because they wanted to. A strange sort of solidarity was born from the muddy ground. Once the new charter was in place and the apology was in my hand, I kept my word. I went back to the dam, this time alone, and turned the great iron wheel in the opposite direction. With a groan, the sluice gate closed. The steady roar of outflowing water slowed to a trickle, then silence. And slowly, imperceptibly at first, Willow Creek began to flow back into the basin. The lake began to heal. I learned something myself through all of this. I had always believed that keeping my head down and avoiding conflict was the path to a peaceful life. But I discovered that true peace isn't about the absence of conflict. It's about the presence of justice. Sometimes, to protect your serenity, you have to be willing to stir the waters. Or, in my case, drain them entirely. The moral of this story isn't complicated. Be careful who you push. You never know what they're capable of. Arrogance and ego build dams of their own, and a single act of defiance, backed by knowledge and conviction, can bring them crumbling down, leaving the petty tyrants to stand exposed in the mud. So, let me ask you, what's the one thing you'd be willing to fight for, no matter the odds? Let me know in the comments, and thanks for listening.